Imagine someone hands you a resume,
Okay.
and under the personal achievements section, this applicant claims to have run 300 miles in 3 consecutive days.
Wait, like 100 miles every single day?
Exactly. That is roughly 4 back-to-back marathons daily for 3 days straight.
Right, which is just humanly impossible.
Yeah. And underneath that, they claim to have run 30 marathons in 35 days. And, just for fun, they also mentioned playing professional football for Crystal Palace, being a star snooker player, and surviving uncorroborated knife attacks.
I mean, if you were a hiring manager at a local coffee shop, you would literally throw that resume in the trash.
Yeah.
You'd think it was a joke.
You would. But the person who submitted a variation of this exact biography wasn't applying to be a barista. They were actually hired to be a chair professor of sociology at Cambridge University.
It honestly sounds like the premise for some kind of satirical novel about higher education. But this is the fully documented realities surrounding a guy named Jason Arday. He made international headlines back in 2023 when he became the youngest black full professor in Cambridge's centuries-long history.
And he was everywhere, right?
Oh, absolutely everywhere.
Yeah.
His appointment was universally celebrated by the press. It was framed as this monumental triumph for diversity and inclusion. And he was presented to the public as this scholar who had overcome just impossible odds.
Including some really intense claims about his childhood.
Yeah, like claims of being entirely nonverbal until the age of 11 and unable to read or write until he was 18.
Which is wild. So the mission for today's deep dive is to figure out how an elite institution's immune system, like Cambridge, failed so spectacularly that this narrative just went entirely unchecked.
Yeah, how did no one catch this?
Exactly. And to do that, we are going to examine a vast stack of source material today, centered around a highly explosive interview from the Winston Marshall Show.
Right. The guest on that show was Nathan Cofnas.
Yeah, Nathan Cofnas. He's a philosophy of biology researcher who basically blew the whistle on Jason Arday. But, as we'll see, the exposure of this alleged fraud is really just the first domino.
It is. It sets off this chain reaction that forces us into a deeply uncomfortable conversation. We're talking about the collision of institutional ideology, the foundations of modern academia, and some incredibly polarizing theories about genetics and race.
Right. And before we get into the weeds here, we really need to issue a crucial, explicit disclaimer to you, the listener.
Yes, absolutely essential.
The source material we are analyzing today contains highly politically charged content. This interview delves into intense, very sensitive debates about race, intelligence, genetic differences, and diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. So, DEI.
And we want to state unequivocally that we are entirely impartial here.
Completely. We are neither taking sides nor endorsing the viewpoints of the original speakers, whether those views lean left or right.
Yeah, our sole objective is just to unpack the arguments, analyze the events contained in the transcript from the sources, and explain the underlying mechanics of these theories. That way you can fully understand the architecture of this cultural debate.
Right. We're mapping the territory, not planting a flag in it. So let's look at the two main figures at the center of this collision. On one side, obviously, you have Jason Arday, the celebrated symbol of progress at Cambridge.
And on the other, you have Nathan Cofnas.
Right. Tell us a bit about him.
So at the time this whole story breaks, Cofnas is a Leverhulme early career fellow at Cambridge. He's an academic, but he also runs a Substack newsletter dedicated to exploring, well, taboo subjects.
Stuff people don't want to talk about?
Exactly. He has this reputation for venturing into intellectual waters that most academics actively avoid because they're terrified of career suicide.
Right. And because of that specific reputation, Cofnas basically becomes a magnet for information that others are just too afraid to publish.
Yeah, and that's how this starts. An anonymous whistleblower reaches out to him with a tip about Jason Arday.
The Whisper Network was already going.
Oh, it was very active within Cambridge. Faculty members were quietly murmuring that Arday's spectacular backstory was entirely fabricated, and that his research was of shockingly low quality. And worse, there were rumors that his core academic work was heavily plagiarized.
But whispering in the faculty lounge is one thing, proving it is entirely another.
Right. So Cofnas decides to actually pull the thread. He takes Arday's dissertation and runs it through a plagiarism detection software called CopyLeaks.
And just to be clear, we aren't talking about, a missing quotation mark here or a failure to cite some minor influence.
No, not at all. This software mechanically scans the text against massive databases of existing literature, looking for string matches. And the results showed page after page of verbatim copying.
Wow. And the target of this plagiarism, who he stole from, actually reveals a lot about the mechanics of academic fraud, doesn't it?
It really does. Arday was largely stealing from a graduate student at Brunel University.
Which is so calculated.
It is. It demonstrates a highly predatory intelligence.
Yeah.
Because think about it. If you are going to plagiarize, you do not steal from a famous, highly cited Don at Oxford.
Right, because a prominent scholar has the institutional backing and the reach to recognize their own work and just destroy your career instantly.
Exactly. But a graduate student at a less prestigious university, they have almost zero institutional power. They are incredibly vulnerable, and their work is far less likely to be widely recognized by peer reviewers.
Man, that's dark. And Cofnas didn't even stop at the dissertation, right?
No, he went straight to Arday's official faculty webpage at Cambridge.
Yeah.
Arday had proudly lifted his quote-unquote top 10 publications there.
Like the foundational pillars of his scholarship.
Yeah, the exact papers that justify his position as a chair professor at one of the top universities in the world. So Cofnas analyzes all 10, and the breakdown is just staggering.
What did he find?
Well, he found outright plagiarism in some. He found papers where Arday was listed as the absolute last of several authors, but there were notes explicitly stating that Arday essentially contributed nothing to the research.
You're kidding.
I wish I was. And perhaps most boldly, he found research that consisted entirely of Arday just interviewing his own friends, writing down their casual thoughts, and then publishing it as rigorous sociological scholarship.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. It operates on the mechanics of a parlor game. It's like someone playing two truths and a lie on their resume, except literally every single bullet point is a lie, and the HR department is just like smiling and nodding.
That's a perfect analogy. Cofnas actually compiled a list of 61 documented claims made by Arday that were false, exaggerated, or entirely unverified.
61.
61. This wasn't someone who was merely oblivious or, a bit sloppy with his citations. Cofnas' analysis points to a highly calculated manipulation of the modern academic ecosystem.
Because he knew what the university wanted.
Exactly. Arday recognized exactly what narrative the institution was desperate to promote. The intersectional triumph of a disabled, neurodivergent minority scholar, and he essentially just fed them a fabricated version of exactly that.
Which raises the most glaring question of this entire saga. If the plagiarism software caught the theft immediately, and if the biographical claims defy, basic human biology like the running stats, why did it fall to a rogue early career fellow with a Substack to break the story?
Right, because Cambridge has layers and layers of hiring committees, peer review, and vetting processes.
Exactly. How does it get past all of them?
Well, the institutional immune system didn't just fail. The source material outlines that it was actively suppressed.
Suppressed how?
Well, the university actually had early warnings. Back in 2023, an academic named Dave Harris noticed the massive irregularities in Arday's work. And Harris didn't just whisper about it in the lounge, he formally raised red flags. He contacted university administrators and even the academic journals where Arday was publishing. And the response from the administrative bureaucracy was to just brush him aside completely.
Unbelievable. But the press was onto it too, weren't they?
Yeah, Jack Grove, a journalist for Time Higher Education, he began investigating the plagiarism allegations as well. But that story was killed before it could see the light of day.
And how do you kill a story like that in the UK?
You use a law firm. The mechanism used to kill it was a firm called Carter Ruck.
Okay, for listeners unfamiliar with the British legal system, Carter Ruck is a legendary, fearsome defamation firm.
Terrifying to journalists. Yeah.
Right, because under UK libel law, the burden of proof is notoriously placed on the defendant. So if someone sues you for defamation there, you have to prove your claims are true. And that can cost hundreds of thousands of pounds in legal fees before you even get a day in court.
The chilling effect is profound. The source indicates that Arday, or maybe the university acting on his behalf, utilized Carter Ruck to imply severe legal consequences.
Just a letter from them is enough.
Oh yeah, even if explicit threats aren't shouted, receiving a letter from a firm like that sends a clear message. It says, publish this investigation, and we will drag you through a financially ruinous legal process.
And didn't Arday escalate things beyond just lawyers?
He did. He actually called the police on Dave Harris and Jack Grove, essentially weaponizing law enforcement against people who were just asking basic questions about his academic record.
That is wild. So when Cofnas finally bypasses the traditional gatekeepers and publishes his findings on a Substack, the story obviously goes global. You would expect the institution to issue a swift apology, right? Like open an investigation immediately.
You would think so. But instead, a coordinated defense mobilized around Arday, and it featured some highly prominent establishment figures.
Wait, who?
Well, the Good Law Project, which is a progressive legal activist organization, they attempted to frame the exposure as this coordinated right-wing smear campaign. Members of Parliament and Green Party leaders even signed letters in Arday's defense.
But the most revealing defense came from inside Cambridge, didn't it?
Yes. From Simon Baron-Cohen, who is a world-renowned, highly respected professor at Cambridge. He took to social media to issue a passionate defense of Arday, arguing that Arday was being unfairly targeted because he is autistic.
Wait, really?
Yeah, he attempted to use neurodivergence as this sort of impenetrable shield against documented evidence of academic theft and biographical fabrication.
I have to pause here because the psychology of this is just baffling to me. Why would a brilliant mind like Simon Baron-Cohen or the centuries-old institution of Cambridge itself risk their pristine reputations to protect someone with a demonstrably fake resume?
It's the big question. And Winston Marshall zeroes in on this exact thing during the interview.
So what's their theory?
Marshall and Cofnas synthesized this theory that divides the institutional leadership into two distinct camps.
Yeah.
The true believers and the moral cowards.
Okay, break that down for us. Who are the true believers?
The true believers are the ideologues. They operate on the premise that traditional metrics of meritocracy like grades, test scores, peer-reviewed citations are inherently racist constructs designed to maintain existing power structures.
Right.
To them, achieving racial equity and diversity is the ultimate moral imperative. Arday was the avatar of that mission, so to attack his credentials was, in their eyes, an attack on the moral project of diversity, equity, and inclusion itself.
Wow. And the moral cowards.
They make up the silent majority of the institution.
Yeah.
They are the professors and administrators who are fully aware that the resume is fake. I mean, they could read the CopyLeaks report just like anyone else.
Sure.
But they run a very quick, very brutal risk assessment. If they speak up and demand Arday's resignation, they will instantly be branded as racists by the true believers. They will face online mobs, potential disciplinary action, and they could lose their social standing entirely.
It's essentially a game theory problem.
Exactly. As Cofnas points out in the text, if you sign a letter defending a plagiarist, the absolute worst-case scenario is that you look a bit foolish when the truth finally becomes undeniable.
Yeah, a minor embarrassment.
Right. But if you attack the diversity hire and the institutional mob turns its sights on you, your career is permanently over. The penalty for truth-telling simply outweighs the reward.
And that specific penalty is central to the second half of this narrative, because to understand why Cofnas was willing to incur that penalty and why his framing of the Arday scandal was so radioactive, we have to look at Cofnas' underlying academic philosophy.
Yeah, and this takes us into deeply controversial territory.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about what Cofnas calls hereditarianism, or race realism.
We really need to define these terms precisely based on the source text, because they carry massive historical weight.
Absolutely. So hereditarianism, as Cofnas studies it, is the theory that human populations separated by geography over evolutionarily significant periods of time, we're talking tens of thousands of years, have naturally diverged.
Diverged in what way?
Well, he argues this divergence isn't just physical, like skin color or height, but extends to the average distribution of innate psychological and cognitive traits. And crucially, Cofnas posits that this includes average genetic differences in intelligence, measured as IQ, across different populations.
And in modern academia, suggesting that genetic differences play any role in intelligence disparities between racial or ethnic groups is the ultimate taboo.
Oh, completely beyond the pale.
But Cofnas centers his entire critique of modern society around this theory. He argues that the contemporary progressive left, what he labels wokeism, is built on a foundational, false empirical belief.
Right. And that belief, according to Cofnas, is the assumption that all human groups are born with perfectly identical biological potential across all cognitive metrics. He argues that if you enforce this assumption as an absolute truth, it creates this rigid, inescapable logic regarding how you view society.
Let's look at the mechanics of that logic because it's fascinating.
Yeah.
Cofnas cites Ibram X. Kendi to illustrate this. Kendi's explicit stance is that any disparity between groups is, by definition, proof of injustice.
Exactly.
If you start with the mathematical constant that Group A and Group B have identical innate potential, but Group A ends up with less wealth, lower test scores, or lower representation in elite professions, The only remaining variable that can explain the difference is systemic oppression.
Right, the environment becomes the only allowable explanation.
Hmm.
And Cofnas argues that this logic inevitably leads to falsely accusing society of systemic racism.
He makes an interesting point about this conspiratorial framing not being new, right?
Yeah, he points out that in Southeast Asia, when overseas Chinese populations heavily outperform local groups economically, they are frequently accused of cheating or systemic manipulation.
And in Africa, Indian immigrant populations have faced similar accusations when they overperform.
Right. And anti-Semites have long pointed to Jewish overrepresentation in high-paying fields as evidence of some global conspiracy. Cofnas asserts that modern wokeism applies this exact same flawed logic to white people in the West, blaming them for any statistical underperformance of other demographic groups.
This is where Winston Marshall challenges Cofnas really hard during the interview, and it brings up one of the most interesting counterarguments in cognitive science, which is the Flynn effect.
Ah, yes. The Flynn effect. So James Flynn was a researcher who documented this massive, consistent rise in IQ scores across all demographic groups throughout the 20th century.
Right, just a global jump in scores.
Exactly. And the mechanism behind the Flynn effect is largely attributed to environmental scaffolding. As societies industrialized, nutrition improved dramatically, childhood diseases were eradicated, and education systems started focusing more on abstract problem solving rather than just rote memorization.
So the brain is like a muscle, and the 20th century environment provided a massive global workout that raised cognitive baselines everywhere.
Yeah, precisely. And Marshall uses this to push back against Cofnas's genetic fatalism. He argues if the environment can cause IQ scores to jump so drastically over just a few generations, then intelligence is highly malleable.
Right. If governments invest billions of dollars into early childhood education, nutrition, and community resources, doesn't that fundamentally alter the outcomes?
That's the argument. Marshall also points to cultural factors. He notes that Nigerian immigrants in the United Kingdom frequently outperform native white British citizens in academic metrics.
Which wouldn't fit the biological destiny narrative.
Exactly. That is a story of a culture that heavily prioritizes educational rigor and familial stability.
So how does Cofnas respond to that? Because it seems like a strong counter.
Well, Cofnas does acknowledge the nuance. He concedes that cultural factors are very real, and that the Nigerian immigrant data is a mix of both cultural drive and what he calls the genetic selection effect. Basically, highly motivated, intelligent individuals are the ones choosing to navigate the complex immigration process.
Okay, but what about the Flynn effect?
His core rebuttal there is about diminishing returns. He argues that environmental interventions have limits and that we are hitting them.
Right. He argues that in the West, we have already spent hundreds of billions of dollars over decades trying to close these educational achievement gaps.
Yeah, we have provided free schooling, nutritional programs, targeted interventions. Cofnas claims that the environmental levers have essentially maxed out in developed Western nations.
So he's saying whatever differences are left.
Therefore, he asserts that the remaining disparities we see are primarily rooted in natural genetic differences. And he says that pretending otherwise forces institutions to adopt fundamentally dishonest policies to artificially balance the scales.
And to see the mechanical reality of these dishonest policies, the source points us directly to the recent Supreme Court case regarding admissions at Harvard University.
This is where it gets very real.
Yeah, this isn't just philosophical theorizing anymore. This is about how elite algorithms process human futures. During the Students for Fair Admissions lawsuit, internal Harvard data from a 2013 study was actually forced into the public record.
And the statistical revelation from that study is basically the anchor of Cofnas's argument. The internal data modeled what would happen if Harvard adopted a purely colorblind admissions system.
Meaning stripping away all demographic engineering.
Right. Making admission decisions based entirely on objective academic qualifications, GPAs, standardized test scores, AP credits, things like that.
And the model showed that under a purely objective system, the Black student population at Harvard would plummet from roughly 14% down to just 0.7%.
Yeah, less than 1% of the student body.
Faced with that catastrophic drop in representation, Harvard had to find a way to maintain their demographic targets without explicitly using racial quotas, which were legally perilous.
Because quotas have been ruled unconstitutional in many contexts.
Right. So the lawsuit revealed the mechanism they used instead. A highly subjective metric called the personality score.
Think of it like a butcher putting their thumb on the scale.
Exactly.
The objective weights, the grades, and the test scores are clearly visible to the customer. but the butcher secretly presses down on the scale to change the final price. Harvard's personality score basically functioned as the thumb.
How did it play out in the data?
Well, the regression models from the lawsuit showed a systematic pattern. Asian applicants who possessed the highest average objective academic scores were routinely given incredibly low personality scores.
And keep in mind, the admissions officers, many of whom had never even met these applicants in person, rated them as less likable, less courageous, and less widely respected.
It's wild. Conversely, black applicants were given exceptionally high personality scores.
So the subjective metric was mathematically designed to outlever the objective data.
Yeah, essentially punishing Asian students for their academic excellence to create space for other demographics. This allowed Harvard to achieve a 14% representation while pretending the system was based purely on holistic merit.
And here is the paradox of Nathan Cofnas. Given his harsh critique of this sneaky social engineering and his belief in hereditarianism, you would absolutely expect him to demand a perfectly colorblind system, right?
You'd think so. Just let the test scores dictate the outcome, regardless of the demographic results.
But Cofnas completely rejects a colorblind system.
And Winston Marshall is visibly surprised by this in the interview. Cofnas argues from a position of cold societal pragmatism. He tells Marshall to extrapolate that 0.7% statistic across all of society.
Okay, so if the very best universities are less than 1% black.
Then the pool for elite professorships, high-level corporate board members, and top-tier judicial appointments will be drawn from that tiny fraction. The resulting representation in positions of societal power would be practically zero.
And Cofnas argues that human beings are deeply tribal. You cannot maintain a peaceful, functioning, multiracial society if specific demographic groups find themselves entirely locked out of the halls of power and wealth.
Right. He says the disenfranchised group will not simply accept the test scores. They will view the entire system as illegitimate and rebel against it, basically tearing the social fabric apart.
So Cofnas proposes a highly controversial alternative. He rejects both the dishonest Harvard model and the politically suicidal colorblind model.
Instead, he advocates for explicit, transparent quotas.
Wait, explicit quota?
Yeah. He argues society should just stop lying about equal potential and secretly shifting the goalposts. Institutions should openly declare, for example, that they're setting aside 2 or 3% of their professorships specifically for black applicants, and then rigorously select the absolute best candidates from within that dedicated pool.
So he believes that transparent quotas are the only way to prevent the Jason Ardays of the world from slipping through the cracks.
Exactly. If Cambridge had a transparent 3% quota, they would have simply evaluated all the black sociologists and hired one who possessed actual competence. Rather than promoting a fraud who fabricated an intersectional backstory just to exploit a dishonest system.
And Winston Marshall pushes back against this quota proposal with everything he has, right?
Oh, absolutely. Marshall takes the stance of the classical liberal, deeply rooted in the philosophy of true meritocracy. He argues that the moment an institution abandons merit for explicit demographic quotas, it immediately creates a two-tier society.
Marshall points out the psychological damage of quotas. When citizens see individuals elevated to positions of authority, whether in a hospital, a courtroom, or a university, based on immutable characteristics like race rather than demonstrated excellence, it breeds profound resentment.
It fractures society just as violently as the disenfranchisement Cofnas is worried about. And Marshall brings up Thomas Sowell to anchor his point.
Thomas Sowell is a towering figure in economics, a brilliant Black American intellectual.
Yeah. Marshall uses Sowell to illustrate the overlapping nature of statistical bell curves. He says even if Cofnas's theories about differing group averages were true, the curves overlap massively.
Right.
Individuals like Sowell exist at the absolute peak of human intellectual capability, regardless of what group they belong to.
Wow.
Marshall argues that individuals can, and constantly do, transcend statistical averages. A system should be designed to reward the individual, not manage the group.
To really hammer this point home, Marshall introduces a sports analogy focusing on Olympic sprinting.
This is a great analogy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For decades, the Olympic 100-meter dash has been utterly dominated by athletes of West African descent. But you don't see the International Olympic Committee wringing their hands over a lack of diversity on the starting blocks.
Marshall specifically notes that you don't see Jewish sprinters protesting the Olympics and demanding a 2% quota in the 100-meter final. Jewish athletes have the Maccabiah Games for their own community, but they fundamentally accept the objective reality of the Olympic stopwatch. So Marshall poses the critical question. If a society can comfortably accept the reality of genetic clusters of extreme talent in physical domains, why do we refuse to accept it in cognitive domains?
Why force diversity in academia when we don't force it in athletics?
And Cofnas counters this by drawing a sharp line between entertainment and societal control. He explains that sports do not dictate the distribution of power, wealth, and governance.
The survival of a community, their civil rights, and their economic prosperity do not depend on who wears the gold medal in the 100-meter dash.
Exactly. But if a specific demographic is entirely absent from the judicial system that sentences them, or the elite academic institutions that write the economic policies governing their lives, the stakes are existential.
So, Cofnas maintains that his explicit quota system, while philosophically ugly to a classical liberal, is a necessary pragmatic mechanism to maintain societal peace without resorting to the creeping rot of DEI deception. The philosophical debate between Marshall and Cofnas is intense, but the source material forces us to look at the severe real-world consequences of actually voicing Cofnas's side of that debate.
Yeah, this brings us to the price of heterodoxy. In the modern academic climate, challenging the foundational assumptions of DEI is not treated as intellectual debate. It is treated as heresy, and it carries devastating personal and professional costs.
We see this first with Cofnas himself at Cambridge. After publishing the Substack essay that exposed Arday and detailed his views on hereditarianism, Cambridge did not invite him to a debate.
No, they subjected him to a grueling year-and-a-half-long investigation.
A year and a half.
Yeah. And while the investigation ultimately exonerated him of formal misconduct, because stating controversial scientific opinions is technically not a crime, the institution exacted its punishment anyway.
Right.
Cofnas held an unpaid affiliation with Emmanuel College, which provided him with vital academic access. The college terminated that affiliation, and the stated reason was not that his data was fabricated, but explicitly because he had challenged the values of diversity, equality, and inclusion.
He was literally fired for ideological noncompliance. And the source makes it clear that this isn't an isolated incident. The transcript brings up the harrowing case of Roland Fryer to demonstrate the systemic nature of this punishment.
Roland Fryer is a brilliant black economist at Harvard University. In 2016, during the intense national focus on the Black Lives Matter movement, Fryer published a highly rigorous empirical study analyzing police use of force across multiple major cities.
He essentially took the raw data and let the mathematical chips fall where they may.
Exactly. And the findings of that study completely contradicted the prevailing political narrative of the moment. Fryer's data did not find evidence of racial bias in police shootings.
And because he published empirical reality that violated a sacred cultural taboo, the institutional backlash was swift and brutal.
The source outlines how Fryer was subsequently subjected to what are described as trumped-up charges regarding his lab's culture. The resulting punishment was wildly disproportionate. A 2-year unpaid suspension, severe restrictions on his ability to teach or supervise graduate students, and the permanent shutdown of his research lab.
The mechanism is clear. Institutions are functioning less like arenas for the fearless pursuit of truth and more like inquisitions guarding a fragile, sacred dogma.
What makes Cofnas' specific journey so fascinating is that he is an equal opportunity offender. His commitment to following controversial data doesn't just anger the political left, it deeply infuriates the radical right as well.
Yeah, the source highlights a crucial event from 2018 when Cofnas was still a graduate student. He authored the very first peer-reviewed academic critique of a man named Kevin MacDonald.
Okay, so MacDonald is widely regarded as the intellectual godfather of the alt-right. He is an evolutionary psychologist who spent his career propagating complex, highly academic, anti-Semitic theories.
Basically arguing that Jewish people are genetically and culturally adapted to undermine Gentile societies, blaming Jewish intellectuals for the rise of liberal progressive movements in the West.
Right. It's dark stuff.
Yeah.
And Cofnas took MacDonald's sprawling theories and dismantled them mechanically in a peer-reviewed paper. He demonstrated how MacDonald systematically misrepresented historical sources, cherry-picked data, and ignored vast swaths of contradicting evidence.
And Cofnas utilized his hereditarian framework to argue that Jewish overrepresentation in various high-level fields, both conservative and liberal, is simply the mathematical consequence of a population possessing a higher average intelligence, not some sinister, coordinated genetic conspiracy to destroy Western civilization.
And this rigorous debunking caught the attention of Jordan Peterson, who publicly endorsed Cofnas' critique. The result was instantaneous. The alt-right turned their digital artillery on Cofnas.
He was subjected to a massive, coordinated harassment campaign by thousands of anti-Semitic trolls, proving that when you challenge the core mythologies of ideological extremes, the mob comes for you regardless of your political alignment.
But the consequences don't remain confined to lost fellowships and Twitter mobs. The ideological hatred eventually manifests as physical violence.
Yeah.
After his position at Cambridge was terminated, Cofnas moved to Ghent University in Belgium. He was invited by a Catholic Flemish student organization to give a lecture discussing his philosophy.
And the source details the aftermath of that lecture. While standing outside a bar with the students, Cofnas was physically assaulted by members of Antifa.
This was in 2 stages, right?
Yeah. First, individuals on a motorcycle drove past and hurled yogurt at him. A few minutes later, another attacker approached on foot and threw a heavy plastic bottle filled with yogurt directly at his head.
Wow.
The bottle exploded on impact, getting into his eyes and temporarily blinding him, which allowed the attackers to escape. And this brings us back to the failure of institutional protection. Cofnas immediately reported the assault. The attack occurred in a public space, and the police were able to clearly identify the attackers using CCTV footage.
But the local prosecutor in Ghent made a conscious decision to decline pursuing charges.
Which is astounding.
The state effectively sanctioned physical violence against an academic for exercising his right to free speech simply by refusing to enforce the law.
It illustrates the terrifying boundaries of acceptable thought in the modern West. If you step outside the permitted narrative, the institutions will fire you, the digital mobs will harass you, and the state will look the other way when extremists physically attack you in the street.
It really is sobering.
We have covered an immense landscape of controversy today. We began by examining the sheer mechanical absurdity of Jason Arday's fabricated resume, a man who claimed to run 100 miles a day while somehow navigating the vetting process for a chair professorship at Cambridge.
Yeah, we dissected how the institutional immune system, paralyzed by the fear of defamation lawsuits and accusations of racism, actively covered up obvious fraud to protect a beloved diversity narrative.
We waded into the deeply controversial philosophy of hereditarianism, exploring the tension between the woke assumption of perfectly identical biological potential across groups and Cofnas's belief in natural genetic disparities.
And we saw how this theoretical debate manifests in the real world, unpacking the regression models that Harvard used to secretly suppress Asian admissions with subjective personality scores.
We listened to the philosophical clash between Winston Marshall's defense of a true, colorblind meritocracy that treats individuals as individuals, and Cofnas's pragmatic demand for explicit quotas to prevent society from tearing itself apart over disparate outcomes.
And finally, we witnessed the severe institutional and physical punishments inflicted on scholars like Roland Fryer and Nathan Cofnas for daring to publish data that contradicts the dominant orthodoxies of our time.
The relevance of this to you, the listener, cannot be overstated. You are constantly navigating an absolute flood of information. You are instructed daily by politicians and the media to, quote-unquote, trust the science, to defer to the expert consensus, and to revere the output of elite institutions like Cambridge and Harvard.
But this saga asks a fundamental mechanical question about the production of that truth. If an institution as ancient and esteemed as Cambridge is willing to endure the humiliation of protecting a blatantly fabricated scholar simply because his identity serves a preferred political ideology, how can you trust their peer review process?
Exactly. And if Harvard is willing to manipulate subjective personality data to socially engineer their campus, how can you trust their sociological research?
When the institutions function as inquisitions guarding a dogma rather than laboratories searching for reality, the burden of truth-seeking falls entirely on you. You have to look past the institutional stamp of approval, examine the raw mechanics of the arguments, and be willing to ask the questions that make everyone else uncomfortable.
Which leaves us with one final, deeply unsettling thought for you to carry forward. We have spent this hour looking primarily at the sociology and humanities departments within elite universities. But if this level of ideological capture, this absolute willingness to discard objective reality and punish whistleblowers to protect a political narrative is standard operating procedure in the social sciences, what happens when that exact same ideological machinery takes control of the medical schools, the engineering departments, and the aviation training academies?